Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This right here, this is a little blue book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book number 1266, and it is titled Great Fighters for Freedom. And it is written by J.V. Nash, copyrighted 1928. This is part 5. We left off at the end of page 46, and we begin with Thomas Paine, pioneer freethinker, the Paine Memorial at New Rochelle, a symbol of tolerance. The present year, 1926, is one that is peculiarly rich in memories of Thomas Paine. It marks the 150th anniversary of the publication of Common Sense, a document so far-reaching in its effect that it may well be ranked alongside the Magna Carta and the famous Declaration of Independence to which it gave birth. In these days, when the country is being swamped with bunk of 57 varieties, common sense of the kind dispensed by Thomas Paine is needed as never before. And the spirit of Paine should be invoked anew by the modern crusaders of the eternal war against bunk. On the influence exerted by common sense, Professor David S. Muzzy of Columbia University says, "It is doubtful whether any other printed work in all of American history has had a greater influence than Paine's Common Sense." Over 100,000 copies were sold, the equivalent of a circulation of 4 million in our present population. Washington spoke enthusiastically of the sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning of the pamphlet. And Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General of the United States, said that the Declaration of Independence of America was due next to George III to Thomas Paine. Let me read that again. Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General to the United States, said that the Declaration of the Independence of America was due, next to George III, to Thomas Paine. The 150th anniversary of Common Sense is being splendidly commemorated with the erection of a beautiful memorial building at New Rochelle, New York, near the site of the great liberator's home. This building, which is to be known as Memorial House, is a stone structure on colonial lines and furnished and decorated inside entirely in the colonial style. This should prove a very harmonious atmosphere for the exhibition of the Paine relics and mementos which the building will house. There will be first editions of all the Paine's many works, some extremely rare, and a collection of original Paine letters and other documents in the museum library. Memorial House has been erected under the auspices of the Thomas Paine National Historical Association, which was organized in 1884 to perpetuate the memory of Paine's public service and was incorporated in 1906. The association has performed a notable service in the achievement of the aims to which it is dedicated. It has numbered among its officers and members men of prominence in public and professional life, both in this country and abroad. The late Moncure de Conway was for some years its president. Its active and honorary officers at the present time include such men and women as Joseph McCabe, Eden Philpotts, George Brandis, Hypatia Bradlaugh Bonner, Edward Clodd, Rupert Hughes, George MacDonald, and Thomas A. Edison. Mr. Edison, who is first vice president of the association, is one of the most enthusiastic contemporary admirers of Paine. At the age of 13, Edison discovered some of Paine's writings in his father's library. He at once became the devoted disciple of Paine that he has remained ever since. Thomas Paine, says Edison, should be read by his countrymen. He declares further that Paine was the equal of Washington in making American liberty possible. The present president of the Thomas Paine National Historical Association, and for many years the moving spirit in the work, is William M. Vanderwide of New York, Mr. Vanderwyde's interest in Paine, he tells me, dates back from more than a quarter of a century, and he says was greatly stimulated by becoming acquainted with Montcure de Conway, the greatest of Paine's biographers. He is well known to the general public through his many artistic photographs of modern celebrities. Mr. Vanderwyde's life has been one of wide contrast and varied activities. Strange as it may seem, in view of his old Knickerbocker name, he was born on the other side of the equator, in the city of Montevideo, capital of the small but progressive Republic of Uruguay, South America, August 6, 1870. A biographical notice of Vanderwyde goes on to say, although thoroughly American, he comes of old Dutch stock on both sides of his family. His grandmother on his mother's side was Eleanor Knickerbocker, and on his father's side he is descended from the famous Flemish painter Roger Vanderwyde, contemporary of Van Dyck and Rembrandt. At the age of 15, he had entered the newspaper business, for 13 years occupying positions as reporter and editor on New York daily newspapers. In 1898, he took up photography as a life vocation, being the first to make photographic illustrations for the daily papers and magazines. He has made a specialty of portraits of famous persons for publication purposes. Recently, he has acquired worldwide fame with his remarkable photographs of the night, among them his series of the Pittsburgh steel mills aglow at night with the illumination of the fiery furnaces. Mr. Vanderwyde is a pronounced radical. His interest in liberalism is the natural outgrowth of his early association with his grandfather and guardian, Professor P.H. Vanderwyde, one of the pioneers of liberalism in this country and a founder and former president of the Manhattan Liberal Club. His interest in photography took him abroad in 1912, and he remained in Europe until early in 1914, executing night photographs of London, Paris, and other cities of the Old World in the interesting art of night photography. Vanderwyde was one of the pioneers. He enjoyed the personal friendship of the orator and agnostic. Turning the page. Oh, there's one more there. Come on now, you can do it. Orator and agnostic Robert G. Ingersoll, and executed the last portrait ever made of him, just a week before Ingersoll's sudden death. I learned that he made the only photographs extent of O. Henry, and that among other celebrities whom he was told to look pleasant are Mark Twain, Julia Ward Howe, Marconi, Edison, Viviani of France, and Edward Everett Hale. He was elected secretary of the Thomas Paine National Historical Association in 1910 and succeeded to the presidency in 1914, to which position he has been re-elected annually since then. Another notable commemoration of this important Paine anniversary is the publication of a magnificent new edition of The Life and Works of Thomas Paine, under the editorship of Mr. Vanderwyde, who is likewise the author of the biography. The work includes much material never before published. Thomas A. Edison has written the introduction. There are 10 handsome volumes, known as the Patriot's Edition. Since there is in all American history no name of more extraordinary associations than that of Thomas Paine, he was the only man who sat in the councils of both the American and the French Revolutions, secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs of the Continental Congress at Philadelphia, and duty for Calais in the National Convention at Paris. Paine was neither an American nor a Frenchman by birth. He was an Englishman, rather tall and athletic of stature, with ruby complexion, animated countenance, and brilliant black eyes, unusual in an Anglo-Saxon. An important figure in the histories of 3 great nations, he was the first citizen of the world. The incalculable value of Paine's service in the American Revolution has been admitted by his enemies. He was one of the founders of the Republic. To him is direct traceable in inspiration of the Declaration of Independence and much of its phraseology. But important as that service was, it continued only one phase. Consisted only of one phase of Paine's long battle for freedom everywhere. Paine, as Carlyle remarked in a famous epigram, would free all of this world, perhaps even the other. Today thousands quote the motto of Paine, "The world is my country, my religion is to do good." Often unaware of its author, and Paine's religion was substantially that of Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Hamilton, Adams, and the other builders of the American nation, not one of whom was an orthodox churchman. The nation's debt to Paine is not merely rhetoric on the part of his personal admirers. As already pointed out, it has been freely acknowledged by some who have been blind to the value of other phases of his career. It has moreover time and again been placed on official record by presidents of the United States from Washington onward. Even blunt old President Andrew Jackson softened into the language of sentiment when speaking of Paine. Thomas Paine, he said, needs no monument made by hands. He has erected a monument in the hearts of all lovers of liberty. Paine was a great journalist. He was one of the first to realize the value of the press for molding public opinion and to capitalize it. As press agent of the American Revolution, he achieved a success far beyond even his own expectations. Yet we may be sure that he himself would be the first to condemn the prostitution of the profession in our day by the press agents of shady movements, superstition, and imperialistic government. A pacifist and a soldier, a statesman and a biblical critic, a poet and an engineer. Paine's contrasts with life were an amazing and sometimes seemingly contradictory variety, yet there was an essential unity connecting all his interests and activities. The son of a Quaker staymaker, Thomas Paine was born at Thetford, England, on January 29, 1737, a date which has become the occasion for public dinners and meetings in numerous cities. The date, however, is old style. His real birthday is February 9th. Within a few days of Lincoln's and Washington's. Until he had reached the age of 37, there was little premise of Paine's ever attaining fame. He had had small opportunity for schooling, had gone to sea as a sailor, and had later worked as a staymaker, an exciseman, a tobacconist, and an usher in a school. He had even thought of entering the ministry, and seems to have been for a time an independent preacher. In 1774, Paine drifted to London. Possessing a native charm of personality, he made friends easily. Among his associates at this time we find the poet Oliver Goldsmith. Horne Tooke declared that at dinner parties Paine was always sure to say the best things. One day in the summer of that year, Paine met at the house of David William in London the great Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who was in England on business for the colonies. Their mutual interest in science soon established a warm friendship between the older and the younger man. Franklin conferred with Paine regarding the latter's future prospects and ultimately advised him going to America. He gave Paine a cordial letter of introduction to his son-in-law, Richard Bach, and other prominent citizens of Philadelphia. While there were at times many matters in dispute between the colonies and Great Britain, it was confidently expected that some sort of peaceful agreement would be reached. Blood had not yet been shed in armed conflict. Paine came to America with a peaceful idea of establishing a school or academy. Long afterwards, he wrote, "I had no thoughts of independence or of armies. The world could not then have persuaded me that I should be either a soldier or an author. If I had any talents for either, they were buried in me and might never have continued so, had not the necessity of the times dragged and driven them into action. I had formed my plan of life, and conceiving myself happy, wished everybody else so. But when the country into which I had just set my foot was set on fire about my ears, it was time to stir. It was time for every man to stir." Shortly after Paine's arrival in Philadelphia late in 1774, Bach introduced him to Robert Atkin, who was just then establishing the Pennsylvania Magazine, and solicited Paine's assistance in the enterprise. Paine accepted the offer and began at once writing trenchant articles on questions of the day. It is interesting to note that one of his first contributions was on the magazine in America. In it, he said, "It has always been the opinion of the learned and curious that a magazine, when properly conducted, is a nursery of genius, and by constantly accumulating new matter becomes a kind of market for wit and utility. The opportunities which it affords to men of abilities to communicate their studies kindle up a spirit of invention and emulation, and unexercised genius soon contracts a kind of mossiness, which not only checks its growth, but abates its natural vigor. Like an unattenuated house, it falls into decay, and frequently ruins the possessor. There is nothing which obtains so general an influence over the manners and morals of a people as the press. From that, as from a fountain, the streams of vice or virtue are poured forth over a country, and of all publications none are more calculated to improve or infect than a periodical one. All others have their rise and exit, but this renews the pursuit. If it has an evil tendency, it debauches by the power of repetition. If a good one, it obtains favor by the gracefulness of soliciting it. Like a lover, it woos its mistress with unabated ardor, nor gives up the pursuit without conquest. The two capital supports of a magazine are utility and entertainment. The first is a boundless path, the other an endless spring. A magazine can never want matter in America, and the inhabitants will do justice to their own abilities. Agriculture and manufactures owe much of their improvement in England to hints first thrown out in some of their magazines. And why should not the same spirit operate in America? I have no doubt of seeing in a little time an American magazine full of more useful matter than I ever saw in an English one. Because we are not exceeded in abilities, have a more extensive field for inquiry, and whatever may be our political state, our happiness will always depend upon ourselves. I consider a magazine as a kind of beehive to store their sweets. Its division into cells which both allures the swarm and provides room, gives every bee a providence of his own, and though they all produce honey, yet perhaps they differ in their taste for flowers and extract, with greater dexterity from one than from another. Thus, we are not all philosophers, all artists, not all poets. Pardon me. Meanwhile, the quarrel with the Great British over the Stamp Act and other colonial wrongs was smoldering. Then, in April of 1775, came the clash at Concord and Lexington between the colonial militia and the British troops. Paine, as a newly arrived Englishman, must have viewed the situation with some perplexity. Nevertheless, he sat down to analyze the whole matter in an impartial spirit, and quickly came to the conclusion that independence was the only logical and satisfactory solution of the political problem, a problem with which the ablest minds in the colonies had been vainly struggling. The pamphlet, Common Sense, written toward the end of 1775, was first published on January 10, 1776. Everywhere it was received with enthusiastic acclaim. Major General Lee wrote to Washington, "Have you seen the pamphlet Common Sense? I never saw such a masterly, irresistible performance. In short, I own myself convinced by the arguments of the necessity for separation." Washington declared that it worked a power change in the minds of many men. The celebrated Dr. Rush remarked, "That book burst forth from the press with an effort that had been rarely produced by types and paper in any age or country." It is generally conceded that it was the publication of Common Sense and the immense publicity which it gave to the idea of independence that prepared the country for the Declaration of Independence. The term itself is found in Common Sense. The following summer, public opinion was won to the cause. Common Sense has been published anonymously, but so able were its arguments and so admirable its style that the authorship was ascribed to men like Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Adams, and John Adams. Hundreds of thousands of copies were circulated, and the humble author generously giving the copyright to the country and actually paying for copies to distribute gratuitously. Paine knew how to talk to the people in their own language. Before his day, political writing had been in the language of the learned, written in an artificial style, and loaded with classical quotations. Simple and terse in diction, Paine had at the same time a happy facility in phrasing. He was the first to speak of the free and independent state of America. Some characteristic passages of Common Sense follow. And I need a coffee break. Here we go. Alrighty. I challenge the warmest advocates for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I repeat that challenge. Not a single advantage is derived. Our corn will fetch its price in any market in Europe, and our imported goods must be paid for by them where we will. But the injuries and disadvantages which we sustain by that connection are without number, and our duty to mankind at large as well as to ourselves instructs us to renounce the alliance, because any submission to our dependence on Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent in European wars and quarrels, and sets us at variance with nations who would otherwise seek our friendship, and against whom we have neither anger nor complaint. As Europe is our market for trade, we ought to form no partial connection with any part of it. It is the true interest of America to steer clear of European contentions, which she can never do while by her dependence on Britain she is made the make-weight in the scale of British politics. Europe is too thickly populated with kingdoms to be long at peace, and whenever a war breaks out between England and any foreign power, the trade of America goes to ruin because of her connection with Britain. The next war may not turn out like the last, and should it not, the advocate for reconciliation now will be wishing for separation then, because naturally, in that case, it would be a safer convoy than a man of war. The authority of Great Britain over this continent is a form of government which sooner or later must have an end, and a serious mind can draw no true pleasure by looking forward under the painful and positive conviction that what he calls the present Constitution is merely temporary. As parents, we can have no joy knowing that this government is not sufficiently lasting to ensure anything which we may bequeath to posterity, and by a plain method of argument, as we are running the next generation into debt, we ought to do the work of it, otherwise we use them meaningly and pitifully. The repugnant to reason, to the universal order of things, to all examples from former ages, to suppose that this continent can long remain subject to any external power. The most sanguine in British doth not think so. The utmost stretch of human wisdom cannot at this time compass a plan, short of separation, which can promise the continent even a year's security. Reconciliation is now a fallacious dream. Nature hath deserted the connection, and art cannot supply her place. As to government matters, 'tis not in the power of Britain to do this continent justice. The business of it will soon be too weighty and intricate to be managed with any tolerable degree of convenience by a power so distant from us, and so very ignorant of us. For if they cannot conquer us, they cannot govern us. To be always running 3,000 or 4,000 miles with a tale or a petition, waiting 4 or 5 months for an answer, which, when obtained, requires 5 or 6 more to explain it in, will in a few years be looked upon as folly and childishness. There was a time when it was proper, and there is a proper time for it to cease. Small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for government to take under their care, but there is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. In no instance hath nature made a satellite larger than its primary planet, and as England and America, with respect to each other, reverse the common order of nature, it is evident that they belong to different systems. England to Europe, America to itself. I am not induced by motives of pride, party, or resentment to espouse the doctrines of separation and independence. I am clearly, positively, and conscientiously persuaded that it is the true interest of this continent to be so, that everything short of that is mere patchwork, that it can afford no lasting felicity, that it is leaving the sword to our children and shrinking back at a time when a little more, a little further, would have rendered this continent the glory of the earth. And I think I'll stop there for part 5. No, I've only got 3 more pages, so we'll go on. I have heard some men say, many of whom I believe spoke without thinking, that they dreaded an independence, fearing that it would produce civil wars. It is but seldom that our first thoughts are truly correct, and that is the case here, for there is 10 times more to dread from a patched-up connection than from independence. The colonies have manifested such a spirit of good order and obedience to continental government as is sufficient to make every reasonable person easy and happy on that head. No man can assign the least pretense for his fears on any other grounds than such as are truly childish and ridiculous, viz., that one colony will be striving for superiority over another. Where there are no distinctions, there can be no superiority. Perfect equality affords no temptation. As an absolute government, the king is law. So is free countries. The law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. A government of our own is our natural right, and when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own in a cool, deliberate manner, while we have it in our power, than to trust such an interesting event to time and chance. Should the government of America return again into the hands of Britain, the tottering situation of things will be a temptation to some desperate adventurer to try his fortune, and in such a case, what relief can Britain give? Ere she can hear the news, the fatal business might be done, and ourselves suffering like wretched Britons under oppression of the conqueror. Yet that oppose independence now, ye know not ye do. Ye are opening a door to eternal tyranny by keeping vacant the seat of government. Nothing can settle our affairs nothing can settle our affairs so expeditiously as an open and determined declaration of independence. But that was a mouthful. When the Revolution began in earnest, Paine dropped his pen and enlisted in the army as a private. He served with the so-called flying camp under General Roberdeau, which was sent wherever emergency called. Later, he became aide-de-camp to General Nathaniel Greene, Rhode Island's popular hero. It was after the long day's march, sitting in the light of the campfire, that Paine wrote the no less memorable papers entitled The Crisis, the first number of which began with the words, "These are the times that try men's souls." Just as common sense had conveyed the civilized population, so the crisis stiffened the morale of the badly disorganized army. Washington ordered it to be read at the head of every regiment. It fired the weary troops for the attack on Trenton on the Christmas Eve of 1776, and buoyed up their spirits during the bleak winter at Valley Forge. Paine was appointed secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs of the Continental Congress, and later became clerk to the Assembly of Pennsylvania. In 1780, when the army was without food and the country's credit exhausted, Paine proposed the creation of a bank and contributed his entire year's salary of $500 to a fund for its establishment. Under the able management of Robert Morris, the Bank of North America, the first American bank, and still existing, was set up. Thus were the public finances rescued from the chaos into which they were falling. In the same year, Paine went to France with Colonel Henry Lorenz on a mission to obtain financial assistance from the French government. Paine had impoverished himself for the cause of American independence, and the return of peace found him in virtual destitution. The nation's debt to him was clearly recognized. Pennsylvania appropriated 500 francs as reimbursement for his expenses. New Jersey presented him with a small estate at Bordentown, New York. New York gave him a confiscated Tory farm at New Rochelle, and finally Congress voted him $3,000, which was largely like the Pennsylvania appropriation in compensation for his expenditures to the public service. He was also honored with a degree of Master of Arts by the institution now known as the University of Pennsylvania. Paine's interest in science had never flagged. In his spare moments he conducted experiments in physics and worked out the plan for an iron bridge, of which he built a model. This was a new idea in engineering, and many of his bridges were subsequently constructed and used. The Great Brooklyn Bridge is in a sense a monument to Paine. In 1787, Paine went to Europe on business connected with his bridge. In England, he soon became the center of a group of political thinkers and produced his well-known works, The Rights of Man. The outbreak of the French Revolution had made liberalism dangerous in England. A prosecution was initiated against the rights of man, and Paine was saved from arrest only by the fact of his being called to France through his election as a delegate to the Convention at Paris, where he hoped to be of assistance in the drawing up of a constitution for France. Paine's plea for the life of Louis XVI from his seat in the convention offended the radical wing. During the reign of terror he was imprisoned for 10 months in the Luxembourg prison and escaped the guillotine by a seeming miracle. He was finally rescued by James Monroe, the newly appointed American minister. The enforced leisure following his withdrawal from the convention gave him time to produce his great classic against spiritualism, The Age of Reason. This book, which has emancipated thousands, brought down upon his head the malice of organized intolerance. When Thomas Jefferson became President of the United States, he offered to send a naval vessel to bring Paine back to America. In a letter to Paine he wrote, "You will in general find us returned to sentiments worthy of former times. In these it will be your glory to have steadily labored, and with as much effort as any man living, that you may live long to continue your useful labors, and reap the reward of the thankfulness of nations in my sincere prayer. Accept the assurance of my high esteem and affectionate attachment." James Monroe, minister to France and later president, through whose efforts Paine was released from his prison cell in Paris, also warmly encouraged him in his purpose to spend his declining years in America. In a personal letter to Paine he said, "You are considered as not only having rendered important services in our own revolution, but as being on a more extensive scale the friend of human rights and a distinguished and able advocate in favor of public liberty. To the welfare of Thomas Paine the Americans are not and cannot be indifferent." After his return to America, Paine spent much of his time on the little farm in New Rochelle, which the state of New York had presented to him for his service in the Revolution. When he died on June 8th of 1908, there he was buried, and there his body lay for 10 years until its removal to England. New Rochelle, therefore, is rich in memories of Paine, and is a fitting location for the handsome memorial house. Lovers and liberty and intellectual freedom. Lovers and liberty and intellectual freedom everywhere will rejoice that henceforth there is to be a national shrine to the memory of Thomas Paine, which will take its place with Mount Vernon and Monticello, about which cluster the memories of those other great constructive libertarians and associates of Paine, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And that is the end of Little Blue Book number 1266, entitled Great Fighters of Freedom, written by J.V. Nash, copyright 1928. Thanks for listening.